The Blackbook project started in 1997. I was a brand new photographer at the Monroe Evening News in Monroe, Michigan. And it was a small town newspaper, but the act of hanging on to my outtake photographs was really something I had started a couple years earlier when I was interning at a small newspaper in Maine, the Journal Tribune. So really keeping track of my personal work and having a place for it, it paid off. It became a book titled Blackbook, a visual diary. It came out in 2000, summer, and it was a blip because a few months later I was living in New York City. And, I think that still holds up. The print quality isn't very good, although the very last picture is an absolute cringer, me with my Leica there in the mirror. But anyway, developing this body of work and making these books about once a year, I had about 9 total. It was just the way I did photography. Of course, I had my professional work, but this was all of my personal work. By 2009, I had the process down pat. This was the tail end of my time in New York City. My wife Yvonne and I, we were living in an apartment in the Lower East Side on Allen Street. And I just love having just the space to kind of spread the prints out. I was doing a lot of work for the Village Voice and the New York Times. Yvonne was doing some international writing, doing some photography of her own. We had a real robust social circle through her work at 288, which is where we met. Our apartment was about 300 square feet. Looks really small, looks a little bit cluttered, but that's just New York for you. But yeah, I look back and such a wonderful time capsule looking at these pictures, the beginning of our life together. This was before our son Julian was born in 2010. But yeah, so I would go up to the roof and do these time lapses of the moon setting and the moon rising. I had this really complicated device. It was a panoramic telescope mount, I guess you could say, and it allowed you to track the stars or the moon or whatever. And it was really complicated because you had to know sort of the amount of degrees that you wanted it to travel over at a certain amount of time. So these are me practicing with that device, and I have these sort of movement time lapses going on. Where you can just see, me sitting at my desk all day. But yeah, this was my process. Develop film, scan all day. Eventually, I decide which ones to print. Those would then go into the black books. And so, yeah, this was really fun just to kind of rediscover these images and really takes me back. This whole decade, though, I really defined myself through the genre of street photography. I was happy to simply contribute to the tradition of the documentation of New York City. I was really happy to live in Manhattan, but I, of course, made some trips. I went to Mexico in 2001, early 2001. A couple years before that, I had gone to Paris, actually, before I lived in New York. I went to Paris specifically to get a book signed by Henri Cartier-Bresson. I paid a visit to his famous photograph location behind the Gare Saint-Lazare. So anyway, but the books that I made were really my most direct expression of this street photography. And I would say a lot of this isn't street photography. I think maybe the word, some people use reportage. It was just photography accompanying my life. There were a lot of things I was really drawn to, couples and nightlife. I think there was a sort of noir to just, being young, hanging out with friends. It was always just, having a camera. I loved these low light pictures, 50 f1.4, but also, just the crazy stuff you see. A lot of that kind of harkened back to my days as a photographer at the newspaper, trying to find feature photographs. Always on the lookout for things that you're fairly certain you're never going to see again. But always the skyline in the city as a backdrop was another direction that I did. But it was after 9/11, the rebuilding, the skyline in general, just itself was a whole story. So I had the books. I also had my portfolio. A whole other thing I was doing was my website, visualdiaries.com, posting regularly there, very much nascent form of social media. But yeah, trying to pick the pictures to include in this, it's a hard game to play. What are my best pictures? What is my portfolio from New York? I've got a handful of pictures that I'm really proud of. I think I was doing a very high level of work for a long period of time, a really nice decade. I can think of, maybe 4 or 5 people that were doing it on that level at that time, but I'd like to think that I really made some contributions, again, not only to the genre, but to just the documentation of the city of New York. It was a real honor to be able to do that for the time that I lived there.